On a commercial strip outside Dallas, a single self-storage facility takes up more ground than the 6 houses across the street combined. Nobody calls it strange. It just sits there, beige and humming, holding furniture nobody can fit anywhere else. Across the country, there are more than 2.1 billion square feet of rentable self-storage space, enough for every person in America to stand inside a unit at once. In Tokyo, a city just as crowded, almost none of this exists. 1 in 3 American households with a 2-car garage can only park 1 car because the other bay is full of boxes. This is not simply a story about clutter. Underneath that beige building sits a legal decision nearly a century old, still active today, still shaping what gets built next door. By the very end, you will know exactly which ruling, which industry, and which choice built this landscape. Start with the size of it. The United States holds more than 2.1 billion square feet of self-storage inventory spread across roughly 52,000 facilities. That is more physical locations than Starbucks, McDonald's, Dunkin', Pizza Hut, and Wendy's combined, all devoted to holding other people's belongings. Occupancy nationally has swung between roughly 76% in 2010 and 95% at its 2021 peak, and even in slower years, it rarely drops below the high 70s. 1 in 3 Americans is currently renting a unit. The industry pulls in close to $39.5 billion a year, with profit margins around 36 to 41%, well above the 22% average across all industries. Public companies now control a large share of that rentable space. That is not a side business. It is, today, also one of the most profitable corners of American real estate, quietly outperforming office towers, hotels, and shopping malls. And almost none of it exists in Japan, a country with a denser population, smaller average homes, and, on paper, far more reason to need it. The United States accounts for the overwhelming majority of self-storage square footage on the planet. Independent owners still control about 73% of facilities, but 5 public companies alone own roughly 37.6% of all rentable square footage, which is an extraordinary concentration for an industry most Americans barely notice driving past it. Average length of stay has been climbing too, recently logged at around 18.5 months and rising, which means this is not a brief stopover between moves. People are settling in. Storage facility, property taxes alone have funneled more than $3.5 billion to local governments over the years, which means even the municipalities collecting that revenue have little reason to ask why the buildings keep multiplying. That gap between the United States and Japan is the real mystery here. It tells us the real size of the problem, in concrete, countable terms. It does not tell us why it exists, or why one country built an entire industry around holding stuff, while another never had to build one at all. The easy explanation is that Americans simply have too much stuff. It sounds obvious. It is also incomplete. Look at the homes themselves. In 1949, the average new single-family house in America measured 909 square feet. By 2021, it had ballooned to 2,480 square feet, nearly triple the size, with bigger garages, bigger closets, more square footage per person than almost any country on Earth. If storage were really about consumer excess outrunning available space, more room per household should have solved it decades ago. It did not. Storage demand kept climbing anyway, even as houses kept growing, even as garages got bigger and closets multiplied. So the problem is not how much room Americans have inside their homes. It is which kinds of homes were ever legally allowed to be built in the first place. Since the 1920s, most American cities have used zoning codes that wall off single-family detached houses from duplexes, triplexes, and small multi-unit buildings, the very forms that historically held a household's overflow in shared basements, attics, and storage rooms. The legal foundation for that wall is a 1926 U.S. Supreme Court ruling, Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company, which made exclusionary, single-use zoning constitutional across the entire country. The case began as a dispute over a single tract of industrial land outside Cleveland, but the precedent it set spread into nearly every American municipal code that followed, copied almost verbatim from city to city for the rest of the 20th century. That ruling never mentioned storage units. It did not need to. It simply decided what kind of housing was allowed to exist, and everything downstream, including basements, attics, and shared storage rooms that never got built, followed from that one decision. The first explanation, that Americans just hoard, collapses the moment you look at what they are legally permitted to build to live in. Run the numbers on a single household, and the abstraction turns into a monthly bill. The average self-storage unit now costs between $127 and $145 a month, depending on climate control, and the typical renter keeps a unit for 5 to 7 years, far longer than the temporary move the industry markets it as. A 2024 Storage Cafe survey found that roughly a third of Americans now use self-storage, with Idaho and Utah leading the country at 59% and 54% of residents respectively, both states absorbing rapid population growth that local housing supply never caught up to, much of it concentrated in suburbs built almost entirely under single-family only codes. Picture a family in one of those fast-growing metros. They downsized from a house with a basement into a smaller, code-compliant home with neither basement nor attic, because nothing else was legal to build on that lot. Their grandmother's furniture, the kids' winter gear, the boxes from the move itself, none of it has anywhere to go inside the house they were allowed to own. So they pay, every month, on top of rent or a mortgage, for space their own home was never permitted to include. Call it a shadow rent, a recurring tax on a housing system that quietly stopped building storage into the house itself decades ago. It is worth noticing how the industry talks about itself. Storage companies market units as a place for life transitions, moves, renovations, downsizing, but the data tells a quieter story. Most renters are not passing through. They are settling, because the alternative would mean finding housing that, in most of the country, was never legal to build. The marketing language sells temporary need. The lease behavior reveals a permanent fix to a permanent shortage. One family's bill is an inconvenience. Multiply it by 14.4 million American households currently renting units, year after year, and it stops looking like a personal failing. It starts looking like policy, repeated millions of times over, billed monthly, mistaken for a private choice. Here's the driver. After 1926, American municipalities used Euclid versus Ambler as legal cover to write zoning codes that mandated single-family only districts, minimum lot sizes, and strict floor area limits. Codes that, over decades, made it illegal across most residential land in the country to build the small multi-unit housing that once absorbed household overflow. Compare that to Japan. Japan's city planning law of 1968, administered nationally by the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism, rather than by individual cities, never created a single-family only zone at all. Even its most restrictive residential category, Category 1, exclusively low-rise, permits small apartment buildings standing right next to detached houses. Multifamily housing is legal almost everywhere in Japan, and it never stopped being legal, because no national ruling ever told local boards they were allowed to ban it. So the void that storage fills in America simply never opened up there. Where an American suburb can zone an entire county as single-family only, a Japanese municipality has no legal mechanism to do the same, because the national framework set a floor on what housing types must stay permitted everywhere. Nothing comparable exists in the typical American suburb, where a single-family only designation can cover entire counties. Now look at who moved into that American void once it existed. Public storage, Extra Space Storage, and CubeSmart, all structured as real estate investment trusts, control a large share of the country's rentable storage space, and their profit margins sit far above the broader real estate industry's average. Federal tax changes through the 1990s, broadening what kinds of real estate could qualify for REIT status, made storage facilities an unusually efficient asset class. Low labor costs, high margins, almost no tenant turnover risk, and tenants who rarely leave once they start paying. A facility can run with a skeleton staff, sometimes nobody on site at all, while still collecting rent on hundreds of individual units every month, an operating model almost impossible to replicate in housing, where tenants need plumbing, repairs, and a landlord who answers the phone. Zoning created the shortage. REIT structured capital found it, priced it, and built a permanent business model on top of it. That is the moment the title question locks into place. The shortage was never an accident waiting patiently to be solved. It became somebody's balance sheet, somebody's quarterly earnings call, somebody's reason to want the shortage left exactly where it was. This was not a secret. Housing economists and zoning reform researchers have been documenting the link between single-family only zoning and housing supply shortages for decades, publishing the same warning in city council hearings, state legislative testimony, and academic housing journals. Restrict the housing types a city legally allows, and you restrict the density, affordability, and storage capacity that come packaged inside those housing types. The warnings kept losing to local opposition. City after city saw rezoning proposals fought and weakened by residents defending existing single-family districts, a pattern so common in American planning that researchers gave it its own shorthand. Public hearing rooms became the actual battlefield where this got decided. Not courtrooms, not legislatures, just folding chairs and 3-minute comment periods. Decade after decade, council after council, with the same single-family only map, redrawn almost unchanged each time. The objections nearly identical from one decade to the next. Meanwhile, the market made its bet with cash, not arguments. Self-storage facility construction spending in the United States climbed from a 2021 low of $4.2 billion to $7.4 billion in 2023, a 29% jump in a single year, and a roughly 1,474% increase over the preceding decade. That is capital flowing toward managing a shortage, not toward fixing one. Occupancy held structurally high through all of it, cycling between the high 70s and the mid-90s rather than collapsing the way a temporary fad eventually does. In Japan, the same national zoning authority that legalized small apartment buildings everywhere also kept individual municipalities from blocking that housing the way American city councils routinely do, removing the exact veto point that kept failing American reform attempts for a century. There was no equivalent American body with the power to simply overrule a single-family only map once it existed, which is part of why the same fight had to be refought, neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city, for nearly 100 years. The American shortage was not undiscovered. It was outvoted, repeatedly, on record for generations, by the very residents the zoning code was originally written to protect. And the longer it got outvoted, the more profitable it became for somebody else to leave it exactly as it was. Eventually, reform did arrive, at least partially. Since around 2019, a wave of state-level upzoning laws and accessory dwelling unit legislation moved through California, Oregon, Washington, and Montana, among others, loosening single-family only restrictions for the first time in nearly a century. Missing middle housing reforms followed in cities like Minneapolis, legalizing duplexes and triplexes on lots where only one house had ever been allowed. These were genuine, hard-fought changes, the product of years of public hearings and political capital spent against exactly the kind of local opposition that had blocked reform for generations in council chambers across the country. On paper, the exact void the storage industry filled should have started shrinking. It didn't. Self-storage construction spending and national occupancy kept climbing through 2023 and into 2024, even in the same markets where zoning had loosened. Here's the second twist, and it is the harder one to accept. The storage industry no longer needs the original housing shortage to keep growing. It has become large enough, REIT-funded enough, and embedded enough in the financial logic of commercial real estate that it now expands on its own momentum, chasing population growth, downsizing trends, and rising home prices rather than waiting on zoning to fail somewhere new. A solved zoning fight in one city does nothing to slow a REIT's national expansion plan in 50 others. Fixing the original cause does not automatically shrink the symptom anymore. The first answer, more legal housing types, was real, necessary, and decades overdue. It was also, on its own, not enough to undo what nearly 100 years of zoning had already built around it, and not enough to make a multi-billion-dollar industry give back the ground it had already claimed. Go back to that beige building outside Dallas, bigger than the houses across the street. It is not a monument to American excess at all. It is a monument to a 1926 court ruling that is still legally active today, and to a zoning template built on top of it that made an entire category of housing illegal to construct across most of the country. A rule still printed in city codes that nobody driving past has ever read. Look at Tokyo instead. Small mixed-use buildings, apartments stacked over shops, basements, and attics built into ordinary housing stock because the law never told anyone they couldn't be there. Same demand for space, in two cities facing similar pressure, similar density, similar limits on land. Two completely different legal architectures, and only one of them produced a $39.5 billion industry built to hold what the houses themselves were never allowed to hold. Drive past the beige building again, and it stops looking accidental. It looks like an inventory of every basement, every attic, every small apartment that a zoning map decided, decades before anyone living today was born, should never exist. Each unit is a small, paid-for stand-in for a room that was never legal to build next to it. The self-storage unit was never really about stuff. It is the leftover shape of every home America was never permitted to build.